Welcome to Interplay Language. The language chapter will provide some really great insights into the nature of language, the impact our language has, what our responsibilities are, in addition to how gender and language play a very significant role in our day-to-day. These are the objectives we hope to accomplish, that you'll be able to understand some of the rules based on language, their symbols, and how they are influenced by culture, the impact of language, both positive and negative, on your interpersonal relationships, the responsibilities that you have for your own thoughts and actions when you are engaging in communication, and the influences that gender carries, gender and power. So let's consider what language is. Language is symbolic. They're arbitrary symbols that honestly do not have any inherent meaning, because we create the meanings. While we have basic definitions of meanings, but as we will learn in this chapter, that the meanings are in us and not necessarily in the words themselves. The basic foundation of language is that it's rule governed. We have rules for phonetics, so the phonological rules, which impact how we sound out the letters. Those are the phonetics, and learning to sound out those letters, a very elementary, fundamental beginning of language use. We start to form our words. Syntactic rules govern the way the symbols are used to arrange the words into a coherent meaning. So the syntactic rules are symbols, commas, apostrophes, semicolons, periods, etc. And the semantic rules, those are the meanings of language. So as opposed to the structure, the semantics are the meanings that we have attached to it, and the pragmatic rules are those rules that we follow in how we use our language. So the pragmatic rules are those interpretations of the messages. Pragmatic rules allow us to apply context to what we're sharing. As I mentioned earlier, we have a language, but we apply that meaning. So the meaning exists in and among people, not necessarily just in the words. For example, I'm going to age myself, and back in the 70s, we would use the word bad to mean something good. So we would say, oh, that's so bad. That meant it was really good. So language is subjective, and meanings exist in and among people, not necessarily in the words. So this doesn't take away of what a direct translation is of a word, or the meaning behind the word, the denotative meaning, if you will, the dictionary meaning. But because meanings exist in and among people, we apply a connotative meaning. So that exists in us, among people, and not necessarily just in the words themselves. So there's a nature of language, and we talked about that nature, meaning that the words themselves have that denotative meaning, but the actual meaning exists in us, how we understand amongst our groups or in groups, how we communicate and share those meanings. So some of the terms that have, maybe there might be a word that has no English equivalent, but we take the word on. So language and worldview can be understood by linguistics or linguistic relativism, which states that a culture is both shaped and reflected by its language, and that members speak. Whoops, let me go back here. I don't know if it's going to let me go back. Darn it. So that members speak a certain way within those cultural groups. So in this short clip, which you can access in the PowerPoint file, you won't be able to select it here in this lecture, but I'd like you to go back and learn about the Sapir-Whorf hypotheses. And this concept helps us understand that our experiences truly influence our language. So the hypotheses is validating the way that we apply meaning. So meaning exists among people and not necessarily in the words themselves. So we know that language has a great impact. The impact of language is just so great. So how I use a term, say with my son, and how I use that term with my students can have a completely different meaning. So the impact that language has on so many different interactions is incredible. So when we think about naming and identity, so some individuals take names very important. It shapes the way we think about people. So if you hear somebody who's named Betty and you hear somebody that's named Mariana, there's something that happens. Would you say not? And no influence on anybody whose name is Betty or Mariana. It's just the example that culturally, I would say that 80% of us in this class represent a Latino culture. And so we make a connection to Mariana as opposed to Betty. So this is just explaining the power of language and how meanings are within us. And sometimes parents will name their children after a favorite character, right? So it has a lot to do with how we view ourselves and how we act, how we create our world within our families, within our circle of friends. Sometimes we, amongst friends, give each other nicknames. So there's just so much power in language. And studies have shown that people with non-normative names can suffer emotionally, even psychologically. I can use an example of my son. His name is Nicholas, pretty common, but his name is not spelled with a CK or with a CH. It's just spelled with a K, Nikolas. And it was very frustrating for him growing up, and even now as an adult, people still spell Nick, Nich, and he's like, that's not my name, it's Nik. So names have a significant power over our language, and it can be positive and negative. It's just a very interesting field to study. And over time, we become comfortable, we accept it depending on our groups, but oftentimes if it's not something we're comfortable with within our in-groups or our culture, it can take us time to accept those things. So think about the affiliation that names give you, right? So we can converge, that means come together, or we can diverge, we can separate from it. So names are very much tied to identity. And as I mentioned, the pronunciation or the spelling also can bring up some really interesting exchanges. So convergence, like I said, is accepting or adapting to match the groups that are around us. So the acceptance of it. So as you are in specific groups, there might be certain languages that you use. Let's say you're a musician, an artist, and there's certain terms and language that you use within that group. And so that is a part of convergence, because as you practice more and spend more time with those individuals, you begin to match the style of communication. Where divergence is the emphasis of the differences that take place where we just don't connect. Whenever I visit New York City, I have that adjustment. So I diverge quite a bit until I start to feel comfortable again. But it takes me a little while because it's a community that's very diverse and it changes so quickly. It's a region that changes so quickly. And so I find that very interesting. Can you think of in your own space, let's say when you spend time with your classmates or your friends that you hang out with, and then you go to another group, say your family or another environment, you'll notice the convergence and the divergence. So again, just an example to think about where you have recognized, or now that you know convergence and divergence and the impact of language, begin to start to recognize what is happening, what are the references meaning, what are they trying to accomplish, what is the message, what are they trying to infer. Start to become more mindful of that during this semester, because that's how you'll grow. You're not becoming mindful to correct anyone. You're trying to understand the space and the growth. Again, if it's someone that you're close with and you're trying to have them walk along this journey with you, it's so great to help them. So we know that there is a great amount of power already in our language. There's a great impact. We talked about names, we talked about groups, cultures. So we know that there is power in how we name and the impact it has on identity. So now when we think about how our language impacts others or our spaces, powerless speech is an indirect message, something that provides a hesitation or a hedge, or a disclaimer. Something like, "I'm so sorry, I don't mean to embarrass you," or "I don't want to offend you," as opposed to, "Hey Doris, I was thinking about our conversation last week and I wondered, was there something that I said that might have offended you? I got a sense that maybe I did. Can you clarify that for me? I appreciate it." So that's more direct. That's more of a powerful approach, not being too forceful. So powerful language can be forceful. So you just want to find that balance. And then politeness, that is also quite influenced by culture. But I think in general, in our mindfulness as we're speaking, we should try to consider politeness. Often in our culture, we are a low context culture, so we're very direct. We can come across strong, but we want to be mindful of our language and what is the goal? What is it that we want to accomplish? Do you want to cause a division in the relationship, or do you want to maintain that relationship? And even when you want to separate from that individual or that group, there's a sense of politeness that you can bring into the conversation when you are selective about your language that will have a much more positive breakaway or breakup. So think about those things. And as I'm going through this lecture, I just want you to think about your own experiences, jot them down as we move along in the semester. You will want to have these references so that when you work on your final paper, your final project, you can bring up some of these examples if you need to. So, dark side of communication. Is there a dark side of communication? Of course there is. Oftentimes we say we're sorry, but we don't even know why we're sorry, or we just use that word sorry. Or I think about in our speech deliveries, if you have a hiccup, you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." But why are you sorry? Maybe you feel like you disrupted something, but you didn't. So thinking about the language that you're using and what are your tendencies when you use the word sorry, it does take away a little bit from our power. So we want to use a more productive, if you will, a more positive, assertive communication. So in your speeches, when you had a hiccup, instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry," you can say, "Thank you, give me just a moment." Or you can just keep going and not even acknowledge the hiccup. Having language that's clear, concise, and direct is a great way to go. So in this short clip, again, you want to go back to the PowerPoint file if you want to watch it. I would recommend that you watch all the short videos. It just gives you a different insight. Some I may ask you about, some I may not. So I just want to keep you focused. And this is just a good short synopsis of gender focused, that women are too apologetic. And that is what research has found in gender roles, that as women, as females, we do apologize more. So when we think about how we use our language, and when using politeness has been a positive thing, sometimes you need to clean things up, and that comes in handy where you need to use a little bit of powerless speech. You want to balance out power and politeness in your conversation as you're approaching situations. So again, powerless language would be a hesitation, a disclaimer, very indirect, where powerful language is much more direct, much more assertive, can be forceful. So be very cautious when using powerful language. And then politeness is what we use in circumstances that it benefits you. So sexism and racism. Sexist language involves words that demean or exclude groups, right? So you want to avoid highlighting people based on their sex. Often I find in my first year college students that many still use the words girl and boy to reference a male or a female. And I'd like to encourage you to move past those terms and identify woman, man. I prefer male or female. But think about what you're using to describe gender. Then we have sexist, well, I mentioned sexist language, and it can, impact both male and female. It can cause some stereotyping, and so you want to be very cautious of that, of using sexist language. I think it happens more often, and research has shown that it stigmatizes females more than males. So you want to try to find a language that is gender fair, or as a non-binary reference, and that way you can have more successful interactions. Sometimes we may not know how somebody refers to themselves, and it is something that occurs so quickly, and I think oftentimes we don't know if we've offended a person or not. I remember volunteering for a group, and again, I'm in my 60s, so things are very different for me as opposed to working with 19 and 20-year-olds. So there was a young lady that I kept referring to her as she, and it was brought to my attention to not use a he or a she reference, but a they. And so I found that difficult for me to refer to her as they. So I just referred to her, he, she, by the name. So the name that she went by was the name that I used. And so it's okay to make those adjustments and to converge in order to have better communication, have healthier interactions. It doesn't necessarily benefit us to diverge depending. Well, honestly, I don't think we should diverge. There are just certain environments or spaces that if we have accepted to be a part of it, that we need to converge. So the term they would be a gender neutral term. And I don't necessarily like using the word they, because to me, they is a separation from me and you. So I'm separating you because I'm referring to you as they. And I personally don't like that, so I don't use that reference. Racist language. So this is a worldview that classifies members from one racial group to another, but it also can create a sense of superiority and inferiority. And so we want to avoid that when we're considering race or ethnicity. So to avoid unintentional racist language is honestly to avoid or eliminate labels. I think labeling is our biggest challenge today, and if we could just avoid labels, it would, I think, make our communication smoother. What do you think? So we found that avoiding unintentional racist language will eliminate potential offensive interactions by avoiding those labels. So think about the labels that you use and how that's impacting your growth in communication, but even professionally. There are some things that we take for granted and we joke about, but honestly, I think the respect for humanity as a worldview, as a whole, is so important. Being able to identify cultural differences, so important, incredibly important. I was thinking about an experience that someone shared with me, and they met somebody from Turkey, and they wanted to meet for coffee. And the individual meeting with them said, yeah, sure, but I don't drink coffee, I drink tea. And they said, okay, I'm practicing with a new blend. I'd love to share it with you. So the I'll say the American assumed that they were going to meet at a tea house or something, but they didn't. They met at a bench, and the Turkish individual brought in a thermos the tea. And the American was like taken back, like, should I drink it? Should I not drink it? But later learned that in the Turkish culture, to serve someone in that way is just a very high regard. It's their way of showing the individual how important they are to them because they took the time to make the tea, to prepare a special blend for that meeting. So as we interact interpersonally, as we interact interculturally, we need to keep aware of, is our language precise or is it vague? Is it unclear? So ambiguous language is very vague. They're words and phrases that can have more than one definition, and that could cause a lot of confusion. So being abstract can be very general, and it can cause a tremendous amount of confusion between individuals. And so we need to learn to be more direct, if you will, more specific. So ambiguous language is very unclear, and abstractness can cause a lot of confusion. A euphemism is a term that is substituted for another. It's an innocuous term that is substituted for a blunt one. And it can be used to soften the impact of something. Probably, I think about death, right? Instead of saying the person died, we say they passed away, for example. So euphemisms can help reduce the impact of a blunt message. However, again, you need to think about the environment, who you're speaking to, where the message is coming from, and where you want to take it. Relative language gains meaning by comparing. So we're comparing without explaining them. So you want to avoid using relative terms to compare. When you're sending a message, you want to avoid using comparison often, but it can be helpful. I think directness is much more beneficial, and learning to use direct language is important. So that's our relative language. Evaluative is much more of an emotional way of communicating. It describes something with feelings, maybe judgment or attitude. So we want to avoid some of these. We want to be much more precise in our communication. So in this abstract ladder, at the bottom, we're much more precise, if you will, whereas at the top, it's much more abstract. So at the very top, it reads, you need to have a better attitude. So I'm speaking to you and I said, Doris, you need to have a better attitude. Well, attitude about what, or what am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing wrong. So in all of our relationships, we use abstract language, but it can cause a lot of confusion. So we need to work on being much more specific. I have this happen often where a student will send me a message and say something about an assignment without telling me which assignment it is specifically. And I think we forget that it's not just us. So I have 64 students. And when I get a message from a student that tells me, I couldn't access that discussion. And I'm thinking, okay, which class are you in? What discussion are you talking about? So I need more specific information. So that's abstract. I'm not getting the information. I'm not getting the clear message. So a much clearer message in this case, as we move more further down on the abstraction ladder, an example would be, you need to stop complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends. And I take that a little further by saying, you need to quit complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends. It creates a negative environment for everyone. I would appreciate it if you would be mindful and just try to stop. So there's a very specific message delivered there. I hope this is connecting with you. Can you think about how you might have sent something that was very vague or unclear recently, and how it impacted the environment or the interaction with the relationship? Again, another short video that you can access through the PowerPoint file. I think these short videos are helpful because they provide some perspective for you. And if you do watch this one, look at the pros and cons of being intentional and being vague. So language carries a lot of responsibility. And as we move along in the semester, I hope that you're starting to make that connection. How we're using language, being accountable for the language. When we approach someone and say, you did whatever, we have to be careful with our choices. I felt scared when you raised your voice and you threw that plate on the floor. It's a very different message than saying, you're always causing disruption, you're making all these loud noises. Very different message. So that's responsibility. Holding people accountable, holding yourself accountable in your language. So its statements replace the personal pronouns of I and me with its. So it avoids responsibility for ownership of a message. And I think we need to be responsible for our messages that we are sending. A but statement has the effect of canceling a thought, but canceling a thought that precedes it. So think about the things that you say and how you're saying that. When do you use it and how are you using it? And then finally, I language. I language is a way of accepting responsibility, and I think it's really important that we practice more I language than you language. I language gives us the opportunity to grow and hold possession of whatever it is I feel, I sensed, I noticed, as opposed to you language, which will express judgment, and it also expresses some assertiveness in that judgment, whereas asserting I to express a thought or feelings helps clarify your wants, helps clarify what you're looking for. And so when we use things like we language implies a joint concern. So we need to schedule some time, 15 minutes, so that we can talk about what happened yesterday. So we're sharing the responsibility. So language of choice is so important. So there's research on you language and I language. And so it's important to think about how we're using this. How we're using the reference of I, you, and we. I say practice I and we as often as you can. Challenge yourself this week. What is the language of choice? What are the words or the pronouns that you're going to use? What are those ingredients in your language that you're going to use to send your messages? Instead of complaining about things, be direct, be decisive. For example, you have a neighbor and you have an issue with them. Instead of walking around complaining, bitching, yelling, just say, I'm going to go over and try to talk to the neighbor, or I'm going to write a note asking the neighbor if they want to have a conversation. Or instead of complaining, say, I really need the courage to go talk to my neighbor about this problem. Or, I need to make this relationship better, so I'm going to take the risk and be mindful and spend more time in how I'm communicating with that person. So just taking responsibility in your language of choice. We talked a little bit about gender and the differences between male and female and the way that we interact socially. And research has found that there are two different sides to language. And as we begin to understand gender overlaps, if you will, because I have friends who are male but are very high on the feminine communication side, doesn't take away of their gender being male, but they were raised by a female, so they have much more of a female tendency, or it may be surprising when someone meets a male that's much more mindful. Well, the likelihood of that person being raised by a female is very high, and we're going to see that a lot more because today we're having a lot of single family households, and vice versa, somebody that's in a single family household that's raised by a male. So you're going to engage in that and not just make these assumptions. So there's significant difference between male and female, and the differences in how we behave and how we communicate. And so I really believe there's not enough research on this specific topic of a male being raised by a female and vice versa. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I think that there should be more research on that. So there are these differences that exist, but they're not as clear cut. So these differences in speech we can find that there's more similarities than differences. We can make the connections if we're very mindful and careful. And just using language that is not influenced by gender, and taking advantage of how we're addressing topics. What's the setting? What's the environment? How we're utilizing our language in the stance of power. Often when we're in a role of authority, we can tend to utilize our language as a power tool. So be very careful how you're using that. Be very mindful of the individuals that you're interacting with. Be mindful. Culturally, we're all over the place, and we forget, and we think everybody operates the way that we do, and we don't. Whether it's gender influenced or not, I find that culturally we're quite impacted by the cultural differences, by the regional differences. Very important to stay away from judgment because somebody's different from us or somebody communicates differently. We have to maintain an open mind and stay away from judgment and take from that other person, gain from that, learn from that. Be more convergent than divergent. How do these points that we've discussed impact you? How do they impact you in your communication, in your environments? Are you operating much more unconsciously than consciously? I want you to be more conscious of the language and the communication that's taking place around you. So in our transition of communicating clearer, we want to utilize the assertion, the challenge, and making requests, but we want to utilize it in a very respectful, mindful manner. Communication is an amazing phenomenon, and as you have learned just in these short 6 weeks, how much is out there for us to learn about our communication practices. This concludes this lecture. There are some additional slides. You are not required to do these additional 3 or 4 slides, but there are some additional videos in the PowerPoint file that you can watch, that you can consider. They help apply. They might be a clip for you to watch and then think about the chapter, think about what we talked about. And again, for your final presentation, you might reference in a short video K-Force that I watched. I found and discovered how we can overuse words and the importance of using concrete language to succeed in an interview. So use these tools or these references, resources that I've provided, because at the end of the semester, and I keep bringing it up, you will be required to do a summary of what you have accomplished. So use all of these resources. A couple of points on crutch phrases that we use. I mentioned disfluencies in the self-introduction speech, but actually this group that I had this semester, you guys were very low on disfluencies, and I found that quite amazing. And a disfluencies would be ums, us, and us. Oh, and you know, my bad, or whatever those disfluencies are, or those crutch phrases that you use. Again, there is another video that you can watch. And finally, some thoughts of how this chapter, does powerless language often make you feel safer, more connected? Think about the terms that we covered in this chapter. We've concluded the chapter on language in our Adler textbook.